Well, hi everyone. I'm Sonya Reichel. I'm a faculty member in the math department, and I'm also a faculty trainer in the Center for Teaching and Learning. In my role with the CTL, I'm focusing on how we might make STEM education even more effective for our students. Some of that's about learning best practices, but as a wise mentor has taught me, most of it's about becoming a best practitioner. As you probably know, the Center for Teaching and Learning is all about professional development. And just like our students, some of us get really excited about learning new things, and some of us get kind of anxious about it. We're super busy with lots of demands on our time and energy. Maybe we're not so sure we want to give what's required for this kind of deep learning and deep change. Maybe we're not so sure we want to face the limitations of what we know, and maybe even the unintended negative impact of how we've chosen to do things or chosen not to do things. Maybe we're a little bit uncomfortable with all the discomfort. Maybe we're a little bit uncomfortable with acknowledging our imperfections, because that comes with learning too. And if any of this resonates for you, then welcome to humanity. Us faculty are really not much different than our students in that regard. As a math educator, I was raised, professionally speaking, by other math educators to have certain beliefs and practices and policies. And some of those have been very effective over the years. But I've been discovering that some of those are harmful. Some of those are harmful because they're based on a model of education that is a century old, and it's aimed at creating compliant worker bees rather than radical thinkers and deep learners. Some of those beliefs and policies and practices have been harmful because they punished the folks who were already struggling the most. And some of those policies and beliefs and practices were harmful because they failed to assess student learning. They failed to hold students accountable for all of the course content. One example of uncomfortable reckoning I've experienced is paying attention to how often I justified my own punitive policies with something like, I have to prepare students for the real world. I'm embarrassed to admit that because I know now that my students are painfully well acquainted with the real world. But this is what I was taught by my mentors, and this is what I believed for a long time, that preparing my students for the real world meant that I had punitive policies. For example, I used to not allow late homework at all, not 1 minute late. One of my mentors told me, give them an inch and they'll take a mile. And other mentors said things like, if students cared, they'd have their work completed and submitted on time. So not only did I have really rigid policies around deadlines, I also made a moral judgment about who met those rather arbitrary deadlines and who didn't. And by not accepting late work, by recording a 0, I didn't even assess student learning on whatever that particular skill or concept was. If I'm honest with myself, my insistence on compliance to these kind of punitive rules had very little to do with the real world and a lot more to do with my own ego, a lot more to do with wanting students to express submission to my authority. And it also had a lot to do with my ignorance of the world that many of my students inhabit. Speaking of the real world, a lot of people say that leading faculty resembles herding cats. We faculty are notorious for missing deadlines, arriving late, leaving early, forgetting appointments. Sometimes we even have to exit a room to use the restroom in the middle of someone's really important comments. most of us are not punished severely for doing those things. If we're not meeting expectations, we as faculty have this whole review process that we can engage in that's designed to help us understand what the expectations are and ideally to support us in meeting those expectations. That's the real world I inhabit. Why do I think my students' world is going to be so different from that? My classroom policies created a more punitive environment than most of the work environments my students are preparing to be in. And even if they are preparing to be in a punitive environment, wouldn't I rather give them an experience now in my classroom of an environment that's nurturing and forgiving so that they have that as a safe landing place to look back on when they need it? As I move into what is the last part of my teaching career, I realize that I want to do things differently. And I realize that I can do things differently. So can you if you want to. We can't fix everything that's broken in the educational system, but we do have a lot of power that we can exercise in our classrooms through our policies and our practices and the ways that we choose to interact with students. My mentors had good intentions, but they conditioned me into some beliefs and policies and practices that have ended up being harmful to students. And for a long time, I just didn't know what I didn't know. But now I am beginning to know better. So now I'm responsible for doing better. I'm responsible for being better. I don't want to work harder. I've already worked plenty hard, and I'm sure you have too. I want to work more effectively. And I want to be curious each day about how I can support deep learning for all of my students. I hope you'll join me in that attitude of curiosity. I hope you'll join me in some experimentation around our policies and practices in the classroom. Let's see what happens. We can change things up. If it works and is more helpful to more students, that's great. If not, we let it go. We try something else. The world is changing whether or not we want it to change. Our students' needs are changing whether or not we want them to change. If we're not also changing, we may become a barrier to our students instead of one of their champions. This kind of change that I'm talking about, it's good for our students. It's good for all of our students. And this kind of change is good for us too. Thanks for listening. I hope you have a beautiful day.